Good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast. A good morning to those in the the Central Pacific time zones. Those who are following us from Israel, Europe, parts abroad, we want to wish you a good evening. Needless to say, with the release of hostages, it has been a very, very, on the one hand, an incredible week for many families. On the other hand, there's been a release of a terrible amount of terrorists who are going back to Gaza, some to Judea, Samaria, some to Turkey. And these are the challenging times that we live in. And we're blessed today to have as our guest speaker, Daniel Flesch. Daniel himself grew up in Chicago, went to Israel, served in the elite paratroopers unit in the IDF. Daniel is really one of the senior scholars at a think tank that he's going to share with us because it's a fascinating think tank. Many of the people involved in that think tank were the architects of the Abraham Accords. And Daniel's really just one of those special individuals that, whether it's his analysis, his perspective, is sought after throughout the Beltway in Washington and through parts beyond on many, many different continents. And Daniel, the fact that you took time to address us, to teach us, to engage us, we're incredibly grateful.
Well, thank you, Steve. It's really quite a pleasure and honor to be here. I first became aware of FIDF when I was in uniform in the IDF, seeing the kind of investment that the organization makes in the soldiers, both while in uniform in the service, and certainly I've learned later after the fact. So it's quite a pleasure to be here. It's not my first time speaking for IDF, but I'm always grateful for the opportunity. And you're right, as I grew up in Chicago, and my journey did not intend to go towards an Israel path, but my last year in college, actually I took Arabic at University of Illinois, and that pushed me back to Judaism, to learning about our religion, our people, our story, and then visiting Israel. And I realized there's a way to do something for the Jewish people that we could not do for the last 2,000 years. And so that was to serve and fight for the Jewish people in our own homeland, in our own state. And I found that there's a way to become a Chayil Boded, a lone soldier, and I elected to do that. I tried out for Tzadchanim, for the paratroopers, and the first thing my mom said after I told her that I had been selected, she's like, "Daniel, aren't you afraid of heights?" So, but for me, it was really a challenge that I could not pass up. And you jump out of planes a few times. It's a great thrill. It's a little scary at times, but it's really wonderful to be able to serve in uniform for the Jewish people, frankly. And then afterwards, I've done a number of different things professionally, but as it relates to Israel, I started the DC branch of an organization called Fuel for Truth, which is an Israel education and advocacy program for young professionals, teaching my colleagues and peers about the history of Israel from Avraham Avinu to the present day, about the conflict, about what are settlements, what is the BDS initiative, what is the apartheid slander, and how do you combat and engage on these different topics and ideas. Then I went to New York for a few years, where I was senior advisor, effectively spokesman for Israel's mission and ambassador to the United Nations under Danny Danon and then Gilad Shalit. Certainly an interesting place to be, serving Israel at the United Nations. No shortage of work to be done there, and it'll never end, it'll never cease. But then more recently, as you mentioned, I am now at the Heritage Foundation, which is the largest conservative think tank in the country and one of the largest in the world. It covers a number of topics, both domestic and foreign. And in the foreign policy, I am in the Allison Center for National Security, and I focus on Middle East, North Africa, and combating anti-Semitism. So certainly with my Israel background and events right now, that is most of my focus, either speaking through the media, writing op-eds, thinking about longer-term U.S.-Israel relations, what could be a strategy moving forward. And I work for, as you mentioned, two individuals, Rob Greenway and Dr. Victoria Coates, both of whom served in the first Trump administration and were instrumental in bringing together the Abraham Accords. You don't hear about them so much as you do Jared Kushner and David Friedman and Jason Greenblatt, understandably, but they were right there in the National Security Council, and they now are my supervisors at Heritage. So there's a strong pro-Israel contingent and ideology at the Heritage Foundation. I'm very grateful to be there, to have a platform to, again, advance U.S.-Israel relations. And right now, there's the new administration, certainly there's going to be a lot of changes, but overall, I thought today I'd kind of talk about, try to provide a nuanced understanding of the hostage for ceasefire or temporary ceasefire deal. Certainly when it was announced about, two and a half weeks ago, everyone has an opinion and everyone has multiple opinions about it. And I am no different. And so I want to kind of provide some nuanced understanding of the how and the why that this happened, expand outward to more regional consideration, and perhaps end on a hopeful note before we can have kind of a conversation, dialogue back and forth. So really, I was saying at the time that I think this deal was a bad deal, but it's not bad that Israel made the deal. It's certainly bad for some of the obvious reasons. If you look at it from a quantitative standpoint, you're going to receive 33 hostages, most of whom are alive, but obviously the number is 8 that are no longer alive in this first phase of the deal, and giving up about 18 or 1900 terrorists, many of whom are serving multiple life sentences. And this is clearly not a 1-to-1 ratio. It's a 50 or more to 1 ratio. There's a lot of reasons that this deal was made, but a way to understand is not to go in thinking that it was going to be a 1-to-1 negotiation. And I don't just say that because the framework of this deal was started back in May of last year. So you're kind of picking up the ball from that starting point and not resetting the table. But really, when Israel enters into negotiations on this, the framework is really from what Israel's done the last number of decades effectively. And just most recently, people are most likely aware of is in 2011, when I was in uniform actually, Gilad Shalit, Israeli soldier, a corporal in the tank unit, he was exchanged for 1,027 Palestinian terrorists. Yes, I did not misquote, it was 1,027. And one of those prisoners that was released was Yahya Sinwar, who we all know is the mastermind of October 7th, and he was killed a few months ago. His brother, Mohammed, is believed to be leading Hamas in Gaza right now. Sinwar was not in Israeli prison for Jewish blood in his hands. Actually, he was called the Butcher of Khan Yunis for Palestinian blood in his hands, but that's for a different story. And at the time, I remember thinking, you can look it up. I wrote a blog during my service. You search my name and IDF, it'll come up. And I remember thinking, 1,027 to 1, if Hamas is to value Jewish life that much, one Jewish life is worth over 1,000 of theirs, who am I to disagree? And it's imperative as Jews, as the Jewish state, to return everyone you can. And Israel has a certain responsibility, whether it's intentional or not, whether it's appropriate or not, whether it should be this way or not. It has a responsibility to Jews around the world. And we've seen this throughout its history. And so the idea that it will go to great lengths to return its people to its borders is not a new concept. So that brings us to now, where the ceasefire, temporary ceasefire, we must keep in mind, exchange is in keeping with Israel's policy by and large. I think there's a lot to be said now about changing that policy moving forward, about what should be done when this war ends, however it ends, what Israel think about how it treats hostages in the future, how it prevents hostage taking, certainly in the future. But in addition, it's not necessarily bad that the deal was made, because Israel's not just fighting in Gaza, right? It's fighting on 7 different fronts to varying degrees. Those fronts have changed, the intensity levels have changed, but those fronts, in short, we know are Gaza, Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen with the Houthis, and Iran, certainly. Not to mention the lawfare component, the public relations, all those other elements too. But right now, Israel will get 33 of its people back, and most of whom, some of whom were civilians, some were soldiers. But ultimately, what enabled Israel to make this deal was really 2 things. One, certainly, I believe, was the election of President Trump, because it kind of reset the political balance, particularly from the United States. Whether he was going to follow up or not, rhetorically, there's language that then President-elect Trump said about bringing all hell to pay in the Middle East. And then you have at the same time now former Secretary of State Antony Blinken saying every time there was daylight between the U.S. and Israel, Hamas would back away from a deal. So you see these things happening, and clearly the new administration would take a different tack, and so that prompted Hamas to go back to the negotiating table and actually agree to a deal. So that's one thing. But also the second thing is Israel's regional situation has changed for the better. First off, in Lebanon, there's a ceasefire right now in Gaza. There's a ceasefire in Lebanon, and just last week it was extended another 20 plus days to about February 19th, because Lebanon, or really Hezbollah, was not abiding by the terms of that ceasefire. If you recall, the objective there, at least for Israel, was to have calm on its northern border so that 80,000 plus of its civilians could return to their homes in the north. And we can't forget that from October 8th, when Hezbollah started firing rockets and attacked Israel the day after October 7th, and Hamas did, to effectively today still, Israel is somewhat smaller than it was on October 7th and October 6th because you have people who are depopulated from the northern communities. So the objective obviously is to return them, but it's not just returning them because they're going to return only when they feel that there's security and stability, which you needed a ceasefire, whatever that looks like, but you need obviously a cessation of hostilities. So Lebanon has been breaking the ceasefire or has not abided by the ceasefire mainly because it has not inserted the Lebanese army into the southern part of the country, mainly south of the Litani River, a topographical feature that basically delineates southern Lebanon from central and the rest of the country. And that's an area that Hezbollah has been operating in. I served in the Lebanese border back in the early 2010s, and we could point out the spots along the border with your eyes and with binoculars. Oh, that's a Hezbollah safe house or building or what have you. And oh, that's a front. There's an organization when I was at the UN called Green Without Borders, supposedly humanitarian environmental NGO that actually was a front for Hezbollah, and they were operating in southern Lebanon. So Lebanon has not been abiding by the ceasefire because it has not deployed the Lebanese army sufficiently to southern Lebanon to assert security control. And not to mention, you'd have seen about a week, 10 days ago, where tens of thousands of Lebanese are trying to move south, trying to go past the IDF and effectively insert themselves into southern Lebanon, again, without the Lebanese army having asserted control over the territory. And there was firing back and forth. But really, Israel has, from the northern border, it's obviously quiet right now. And a concern with the Lebanese ceasefire when it was first implemented in late November was, well, perhaps certainly Hezbollah would try to reestablish itself, and what's going to prevent Israel from taking offensive kinetic operations into southern Lebanon. This is always a concern that would the U.S. or France or the international community in general restrain Israel? And that does not seem to be the case. So that ceasefire, while it is shaky, the fact that it's being extended, it's a ceasefire meaning it's a phased deal right now, at the end of which I believe the date is February 19th, there should be a permanent ceasefire. Not a peace, not a truce, but a permanent ceasefire. Right now, the IDF is still in Lebanon, but the idea is by that date, which should have been a week ago, by that date, there'd be enough, the Lebanese army would have inserted control that the IDF could retreat back south of the blue line of the border between Israel and Lebanon. So, but for all intents and purposes, Israel has its northern border under control. In Syria, we know that the Assad regime fell abruptly, and that is notable for many reasons, but for our purposes here, it severs a direct connection in land bridge from Iran to Lebanon, from which it was supplying Hezbollah with arms, with weapons, with missiles, with other rockets to attack Israel. And the leader right now, Al-Jolani of HTS, has said that we're going to make sure that Iran stays out of this. I mean, listen, with HTS right now, they are a Sunni Islamist organization. It's a don't hold your breath. Certainly, maybe distrust, but verify whenever you see them making statements and seeing how they play this new regional balance with Turkey, with Lebanon, with Israel, with Iraq, Iran, and the United States, and other forces and powers in the region. But by and large, the Syrian border, the Golan for Israel, is no longer a direct or even perhaps a low-level threat. So that's very good. As it pertains to Yemen, I mean, the Houthis have been attacking, firing missiles, intermittently. Some have gone through over the summer or fall. Some got through to Tel Aviv. There are a few casualties. But by and large, Israel has shown that it is able to reach Sana'a, reach Yemen effectively with impunity, which is important because it's a great distance away, 1,500 plus kilometers away, and that may be a trial run if it ever, if it again returns to Iran. So Yemen is kind of quieter right now. And then finally, the main one which is Iran. Israel demonstrated twice that it can attack Iran with effective impunity. And not to mention, despite launching the first and largest ever combined ballistic missile, cruise missile, and drone attack last April, not much damage was done. And I do mean that it's every casualty is unfortunate, but certainly not much damage was done. Of course, Israel, as a former Iranian president, Rafsanjani, once said that Israel is a one-bomb country, and that is sadly largely true. So you don't need to have dozens of Iranian missiles land somewhere in near the central part of Israel, you effectively just need one. So that's really, Israel cannot allow any through. So the fact that any got through could be viewed as a failure in some ways. But by and large, it did not, Iran was not able to inflict the kind of damage that many people for years thought it would be. And it's a similar story, I'm not going to get into it, but a similar story with Hezbollah. Hezbollah was viewed as a greater threat than Hamas for years, since 2006, since the Second Lebanon War. But look what Israel did, effectively dismantling Hezbollah in pretty quick succession. So just to say that, and then with the October attack, that one did cause more damage in Israel, and more rockets, or more missiles, got through. But what Israel did in response was even more mind-blowing than all the other mind-blowing things he's been doing over the last 15 months, which is it sent hundreds of airplanes across the region, flying over Iranian airspace for hours effectively without resistance, taking out the air defense systems and flying over Tehran with impunity again, and also taking out undeclared nuclear sites. So Israel is in a much stronger strategic position today than it was certainly in October 6th in some ways, but certainly October 7th, certainly October 8th, and really for kind of a couple months thereafter. Because if you think back to October last year, you had names like Ismail Haniyeh and Yahya Sinwar from Hamas on the game board. You had Hassan Nasrallah in Lebanon. You had Assad in Syria. You have, again, the Iranian threat. But now, and not to mention other senior and second and third level leaders in Hamas and Hezbollah, but they're all eliminated. The pager attack and walkie-talkie attack and Operation Northern Arrows in Lebanon, killing Nasrallah and decimating Hezbollah's stockpile. All these things mean to say that suddenly Israel can refocus on Hamas, which is the initial goal of this war, were twofold. A, to destroy Hamas, and B, to return the hostages. Now, at some point, those goals would come into tension, most likely, but not assuredly, come into tension with each other. And the question was, well, which would you choose? That was a much more difficult question for Israel to answer months ago. But now, getting back to with the battlefield changing and President Trump's election, Israel is able to suddenly say, okay, we're kind of secure to some extent on our other fronts. Let's focus on Hamas. And Hamas is sufficiently destroyed. We're controlling the Philadelphia corridor between Israel and Egypt. We have the Netzarim corridor, which has been bisecting Gaza. Granted, that's being relinquished now with the phase one of the deal. But maybe we can actually play for getting our hostages out, because they don't have time. We have time to defeat Hamas, but they don't have time. Now, to wrap up, I'd say one note on the deal and one note on looking forward is that this deal is supposed to be 3 phases, of which phase 2 and phase 3 are going to start being negotiated soon, if not already. And in phase 2, the idea is that more hostages would come out, and you have starting a phased withdrawal, more so of the IDF. And the idea is at the end of phase 3, you'd have all the Israeli hostages out, you'd have all of the IDF out, and you'd have a surge of humanitarian aid, basically reconstruction. Think about this is actually the day after. I am not so optimistic. I'm highly skeptical that phases 2, much less phase 3, will come to fruition, largely because, first off, Hamas already broke the deal last week when it did not release, released soldiers before civilians. And actually it was a PIJ, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, that was holding some of the hostages. So they've already broken the deal once. The reason that the deal broke in November of 2023 was due to them as well. So this is a habit. And not to mention, it's hard to see the Israeli public stomaching at the end of phase 3, Hamas still surviving, at least as it's currently constituted. I don't know if Hamas will be effectively defeated. It hasn't been destroyed in 15 months. I don't know what a few more months will do. Granted, it's a new administration, new kind of perception of American relationship with Israel, but that's one thing. And the second thing is, to end on this note, is it's been a very trying and difficult and traumatic 15 months, but I think Israel, perhaps most in the world, but certainly in the West, is best poised for growth and future success. You can look at something as the happiness index that was released earlier this summer, or last summer rather, that Israel is 5th happiest country in the world. But really, it's what this war has been and is doing to the Israeli people, to society. Granted, when the war is over, whenever that comes, you're going to have a recurrence of social division, of political division, of judicial reform, of all these other things. But the fact is, you had 15 months of Haredim and secular soldiers in different capacities serving with each other, those from the north, those from the south, of all walks of life, serving with each other. And really, if you want to call this, which I think is appropriate, it was called the beginning, I think it still can be called Israel's second war of independence. I think you're seeing that there's a new generation of leaders that's been created through the crucible of this war, and who have a sense of purpose, a sense of understanding of their place in Israeli society today and Jewish history. And so for that reason, I think it's, again, we should still be on guard for the next number of months, even a couple of years. But by and large, certainly, invest your time, your money, your resources in Israel and of the organizations that help sustain it, such as FIDF. So with that, I'll pause. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Couple of questions. The Lebanese army, okay, we now see reports that the head of the Lebanese army was actually sharing secret documents, secret information with Hezbollah. Is there any confidence, number one, in the functionality of the Lebanese army? And is it an incompetent army, or is it actually a functional army? Number two is, because of the fear they have of Hezbollah, and because of the intimidation that Hezbollah has over them, can they, even if they're an effective army, will they choose to be effective? And will they actually choose to engage, to challenge their fellow Lebanese, meaning the Shia of the South, when Israel removes itself? Many are skeptical when that question comes from a deep sense of disappointment, a deep sense of skepticism based upon how the Lebanese have acted over the course of the last 4 or 5 decades. And how do you see it? How does the think tank see it? What insight can you share with us?
Certainly, and I think skepticism is really that is the best approach to most things in the Middle East, at least outside of Israel, even in Israel to an extent at times. But I'd say I hope it'd be functional, capable, no less, because as an American taxpayer, we've been sending millions of dollars a year to help support the PLA, the SLA, Southern Lebanese Army, and so I'd hope it would be functional to an extent. But really, the Lebanese army has been non-existent. And we talk about Hezbollah and Hamas to an extent as terror organizations. They're really not. They're terror armies. In the case of Hezbollah, very much so, because they are a part of the Lebanese government, the parliament in particular. And I could say Hamas also is a governing authority in Gaza, so they are de facto the Gazan army in some ways. I think it's not an inappropriate thing to say. But as it pertains to Hezbollah, the Lebanese army, they have a great opportunity, whether they seize it or not, whether they're able to or not, whether there's sufficient opportunities to root out the corruption, as you mentioned, between the symbiotic relationship, or whatever relationship they have between the Lebanese army and Hezbollah. There's a new opportunity here if the West, mainly the United States, as well as France, because France has a unique relationship with Lebanon, to ensure that the Lebanese army actually abides by its mandate, which is to defend its territory and not to work with Hezbollah. I say this because Hezbollah is as weak as it's ever been. And it's not just somewhat weak, it's completely weak. It's on its knees. It's lost its patron, at least direct ties right now with Iran, again, because Syria has fallen, the Assad regime has fallen, and its entire senior leadership is gone. And now those people can be replaced, certainly, but you can't replace one-to-one Hassan Nasrallah for many reasons, not only his longevity at the role, but his charisma and the kind of way he led the organization. So there's a great opportunity to exploit this vacuum, this power vacuum. The question is, will there be the will, I think, really on the part of the West to ensure that happens, to tie aid and support for the military with conditions that are established with a ceasefire with Israel. That if you actually do not abide by the terms of the ceasefire and you work with Hezbollah, then we're going to cut you off or even inflict punitive sanctions or other retaliatory measures against you. There's also a third element here that we can't forget, which is UNIFIL, the UN interim force in Lebanon. Now, one thing Israel is certain about moving forward, and the Ambassador Danny Danon, my former boss, reassured the UN last week that UNRWA's time in Israel is ending in Jerusalem. Israel has a different relationship with the UN these days, at least the UN organizations, than it did on October 6th. I mean, it's not really going to abide by UN security or other guarantees, in this case with UNIFIL in Lebanon. So I think skepticism is highly warranted. There is certainly hope that we want the Lebanese army to assert itself. We would love Lebanon to to pull itself away from the clutches of Hezbollah and Iran, to assert its own sovereign destiny and its own control of its own country.
So Daniel,
Yeah.
let's play the chessboard for a second. Let's assume that the Lebanese army fails. Okay, what happens next?
Well, I think Israel's demonstrated that it will take whatever measures it needs to ensure that Hezbollah does not establish entrenched positions in southern Lebanon. So I think, and the chessboard has sufficiently changed from October 6th and October 8th that that Israel will act proactively with air operations or ground forces if need be. And now, particularly with a new administration in the White House, I think you'll have greater support for that. At least you won't have someone saying, no, don't do that. Let's have peace negotiations or talks first. So I think Israel has a sense that it needs to act proactively in its region, particularly on its immediate borders, to ensure its security. Because again, I return to the fact that Zionism retrenched a little bit in terms of territory over the past year plus. So I'm less concerned now that Hezbollah rearming in southern Lebanon, that Israel will not be able to do something about it. You'll have greater support. You already have support within Israel, and you'll have support here in the United States for that.
Okay. Talk, please, about phase two, if there will be a phase two, what it will look like.
So its specifics, like I said, are going to be determined when phase one was announced, when the ceasefire agreement was announced. The specifics just talked about phase one, and this is part of a let's not bite off more than we can chew right now. Let's figure out phase two at the end of the 42 days, which would be implemented. Let's figure out phase two and then phase three at a later date. So the specifics again aren't determined, but it will see more of the hostages released and a continued phased redeployment of the IDF away from populated areas in Gaza, even to the Israeli border, because the idea is that there is less friction and less difficulty transitioning from phase two to potentially phase three, which would see the end of the war. And it's at this point that the humanitarian hostages, meaning those who are female civilians, female soldiers, the elderly, and sick, that humanitarian category of hostages would have already been back. And so what's left are men of a certain age and male soldiers, which Israel wants to return everyone it can, but it's been this prioritization even from a year ago, the first negotiation deal. So that's what it's looking like in terms of the structure of it. But again, it's unclear how long that will take. Meaning phase one is supposed to go on for 42 days. That will be phase two will be a little bit longer after that, and then phase three will be after that. But beyond that, we don't have more specifics just yet. However, phase two would be a crucial point, because if phase one actually comes to fruition, and after 6 weeks in March, when phase one is over, or late February when phase one is over, depending if all the hostages are out, if last week's situation where Hamas broke the terms was the only time, then it's more likely that phase two will begin. But again, like I said in my opening statement, I don't really believe that phase two will come to fruition, nor so will phase three.
And in terms of what you see, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, other potential investors in the rebuilding of the Gaza area, mm-hmm. There's no way, I'm making an assumption, challenge any assumption that I make in this question. There's no way they're investing in a population that's going to be run and controlled by Hamas. In other words, even if Hamas continues to exist as a movement, there's no way the world tolerates Hamas running the Gaza Strip the way they are right now, because de facto Hamas is running the Gaza Strip. Under what circumstances could you have a Gaza Strip not run by Hamas and run, let's say, by the various clans or some other a breakdown of, let's say, the UAE taking part of it, Saudis running another part of it, the EU running another part, whatever the situation mm-hmm. is. How do you see a scenario where Hamas is not in control?
That's really kind of the $64,000 or whatever dollar question it is. The question of how to rebuild, if you look back the day after the rebuilding Gaza, where are the pitfalls? It's not in investment. It's not in rebuilding or humanitarian support, because that can be done. That's effectively money and organizations that are already established or can quickly be established, and it's getting money from the Gulf or other Arab partners, from the West, from the UN to do that. That's not the main hiccup or pitfall. The question is, kind of you get to, is security control. Who ensures the monopoly on violence, which is the sine qua non for having sovereign control over a territory, and that who's the governing force in Gaza? And that, Israel will do that by default simply because the IDF is there, and Israel's not really going to, like I said, offload any security assurances to any other organization, least of all the United Nations, and other Arab partners would be difficult. What incentive would there be for the Abraham Accords countries or any other country to put their own people in uniform or out on the ground in Gaza? They'd be targets. They'd be looking at perhaps doing the bidding of the Zionist entity, call it what you want. So that's really the main concern. And it's really unclear how you get there, particularly if, Hamas is still a constituted force. And that's in part why I say I don't think this war is going to be ending soon, because Hamas is still there, and you can't allow for a day after without a Hamas, so long as they, as the last administration said, even before a few weeks ago, that they've recruited a few thousand new troops. Of course, to put some cold water on that, they can give someone an AK-47 and a green Hamas headband and say they're part of Hamas, but they're not the seasoned veteran fighter that they were, having 24 brigades on October 6th or October 7th. So keep that with a grain of salt. But does show that their ability to recruit from the population and their support still in the population. So it's really about how do you get an organization or a country to ensure security force there. I think the United States is going to be heavily involved. I think Morocco actually could be a great partner here, because Morocco is a part of the Abraham Accords, so they have good ties with Israel. Not to mention I think about half of Israel, if not more, has some sort of Moroccan heritage. But also they have an experience with de-radicalization in their own country. Iran has been trying to make inroads in Morocco for many years, and Morocco is, under the king, has a number of things to try to de-radicalize its population away from extreme Shia ideology, and they're a Sunni country. So in terms of de-radicalization, the Moroccans could offer something there, and not to mention they have a fairly capable fighting force. They could actually offer security assurances on the ground, but they're not going to be doing that alone. You're going to have the IDF and some presence, and even Hamas is not the governing force. The fact is, they are reverting from a terror army, perhaps back to a terror organization, and will be conducting low-level guerrilla insurgent warfare for probably the foreseeable future. That's obviously, now we're starting to project out a little too much and not really sure what it could look like, but there's no really great answer. And the question, again, to wrap this up, is that it's not a question of financial or other capabilities. It's a question of who is going to ensure security in Gaza. And that's really still an open question. There are thoughts and ideas out there, but no one's really stepping up to say, I will do this. And Israel also would be hesitant to accept anyone but certain assurances, primarily from the United States.
So we're looking at a very, very tenuous and a very, very unknown future in terms of Gaza.
To say the least. I mean, the good news is, and there's always, we have to look at some good news. The good news is, it relates to Gaza. Gaza is not Judea and Samaria. It's not the West Bank. It is tucked away along the coast, along Egypt. So it's, to say it's contained was kind of the same thinking on October 6th, so I don't want to go that far. But it is something now that it can be managed to an extent, and the word managed is also kind of fraught with concern, because Israel is managing the conflict before October 7th. But Israel is wise to an understanding the security situation, the political relationship with Gaza has to change, is going to change. So it's not going to be as complacent as it was for the years prior. That's kind of some of the good news. And again, Israel, part of the reason that Israel is able to do this hostage deal is because a big question in October of 23 was, okay, Israel was going to take the war to Gaza and against Hamas. But the question is, would they do it in such a way that they would no longer be viewed as, on the defensive, and would they be viewed as a strong force in the region? Basically, this gets to Saudi Arabia, is because would Saudi Arabia look at Israel and say, you know what, that's really a country we actually want to normalize it with, because look what Hamas did, but look what Israel did in response. And Israel today is, the undisputed strong horse in the region. So it can afford to take some risks or its foot off the pedal a little bit as relates to Gaza, to get its hostages out and to refocus on the broader regional security picture, and particularly the main threat, which is still Iran.
And maybe the next time we have you as our guest, we can talk about Iran.
Maybe we can. That'd be wonderful.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you for sharing with us. And look, we know that the influence that the Heritage Society has as we look forward over the next couple of years to the expansion of the Abraham Accords. Obviously, you will be one of the key think tanks that will help shape the foreign policy of the United States and hopefully expand the Abraham Accords and make the world a safer, a better, and a finer place. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you for all you and the FIDF do. I really appreciate it. Thank you for having me.